A decades-old wound in Chicago's history has been ripped open, exposing secrets buried since 1963. A prominent business figure stands accused of a crime that has haunted the community for generations. The revelation has left longtime residents questioning everything they thought they knew about their neighbor. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The fog clung to Chicago's Gold Coast like a ghost, muffling the sounds of the waking city. Detective Sarah Chen pulled her coat tighter against the March chill, her breath forming small clouds as she stood before the imposing Tudor home. Her knuckles rapped against the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing through the quiet morning. In her other hand, she clutched a worn manila folder containing decades of unanswered questions. Inside, Colleen Sullivan Riley flinched at the unexpected knock. She'd been up since 5, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. At 57, Colleen had spent most of her life with the weight of family tragedy pressing down on her shoulders. The disappearance of her Aunt Margaret Ann Sullivan had cast a shadow that stretched across generations. She set down her cup and moved toward the door, each step measured and cautious. "Miss Riley, I'm Detective Sarah Chen with the Chicago Police Department." The officer's voice was steady, professional, yet there was an undercurrent of something Colleen recognized immediately. The same determination that had driven her family for decades. "You're here about Aunt Margaret," Colleen said. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, her dark eyes meeting Colleen's. "May I come in?" The living room was tastefully decorated with family photos spanning decades. Sarah noticed one prominently displayed, a young woman with a bright smile and hopeful eyes. "Margaret Ann Sullivan, forever 22. We've reopened your aunt's case," Sarah explained, carefully laying out documents on the coffee table. "Recent advances in genetic genealogy have given us new tools we didn't have before." Colleen's face remained impassive, but her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she reached for one of the papers. "We've heard promises before, Detective." "I understand your skepticism," Sarah replied. "Your family has been let down too many times." 54 years, Colleen whispered. 54 years of dead ends and false hopes. Sarah leaned forward. "This is different. Dr. Ellen Grace from Parabon Nanolabs is working with us. She's been able to extract usable DNA from evidence that's been in storage since 1963. Colleen looked up sharply. "You found something?" "We might have," Sarah said carefully, "but I need to ask you some questions about your aunt's connections to the Gold Coast neighborhood back then." Colleen's eyes drifted to the photograph again. "My father, Patrick, he's the one who knows the most. He never stopped looking for answers." "I'd like to speak with him too," Sarah said. "Hope is a dangerous thing, Detective Chen," Colleen said, her voice barely audible. "In this family, we've learned that lesson the hard way." Sarah nodded, understanding all too well. Her own mother's disappearance had taught her the same painful truth. "Sometimes, Miss Riley, dangerous is exactly what we need." Margaret Ann Sullivan was born and raised in the heart of Bridgeport, a neighborhood where church bells and factory whistles marked the passing of time. The streets were a patchwork of modest homes, each filled with families who knew one another by name and history. For the Sullivans, like many Irish Catholic families in the area, faith wasn't just practiced, it was woven into the fabric of daily life. Every morning, Margaret would walk the 4 blocks to St. Mary's Bridget Church, her rosary beads wrapped around slender fingers as she slipped into the wooden pew. The familiar scent of incense and beeswax candles became as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. Her mother often said that Margaret had been born with a prayer on her lips. Sundays were sacred in the Sullivan household. After Mass, the family gathered around their scratched oak table, where steam rose from platters of roast beef, potatoes swimming in butter, and vegetables from their small backyard garden. Patrick, still a teenager then with dreams of joining the police force, would tease his sister about her stubborn dedication to saving every penny. "You'll be the richest nurse in Chicago," he'd say, reaching for another helping of potatoes. Margaret would just smile, her eyes bright with determination. Someone has to take care of this family when you're chasing criminals all over the city. Working at Illinois Bell Telephone Company wasn't glamorous, but Margaret approached it with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything. She answered calls with a voice that made strangers feel like old friends. Each payday, she'd carefully divide her earnings, a portion for the household, a portion for church, and the rest tucked away in a small metal box labeled Loyola in neat handwriting. In the evenings, she'd spread nursing school brochures across the kitchen table, tracing her fingers over the photographs of white-capped nurses. Her mother would watch from the doorway, pride and worry battling in her expression. "You'll make a fine nurse," she'd say. "Those patients will be blessed to have you." The neighborhood watched Margaret with collective affection. She was Bridgeport's daughter, the girl who helped elderly Mrs. O'Malley with groceries, who tutored the Fitzgerald children in mathematics, who sang in the church choir with a voice that made the most hardened hearts soften. No one could have imagined that summer would be her last, that the dreams carefully saved in that metal box would never come to fruition, that Sunday dinners would forever have an empty chair. In August 1963, promise collided with tragedy, and all those carefully laid plans scattered like autumn leaves. The neighborhood that had watched her grow would now gather in stunned silence, asking questions that would echo unanswered for decades. August 17th, 1963, marked the last day of Margaret Ann Sullivan's life. The Illinois Bell switchboard had been busy all day, and as the humid dusk settled over Chicago, Margaret gathered her belongings, tucking her rosary into her handbag. The air was thick with summer heat as she waved goodbye to her coworkers, her smile betraying no hint of the tragedy that awaited. "Are you sure you don't want to ride, Maggie?" called Janet from accounting, keys jingling in her hand. "It's getting dark." Margaret shook her head. "My parents didn't raise me to depend on others," she replied with characteristic determination. The 22-year-old had been saving for nursing school at Loyola, and self-reliance was a virtue she held dear. She straightened her blue dress and headed toward the bus stop on Dearborn Street, her sensible heels clicking against the pavement. That rhythmic clicking faded into the gathering darkness. It was the last sound anyone would associate with Margaret alive. The following morning, a jogger discovered her body in Lincoln Park, near North Pond. The scene was meticulously arranged in a way that would haunt investigators for decades. Evergreen branches had been carefully placed over her body, as if the killer wanted to both conceal and display his work. Her shoes, the ones that had carried her toward her fate, were positioned neatly beside her, an unsettling touch of order amid chaos. Her handbag was nowhere to be found, but clutched in her right hand was the silver crucifix she had received for her first communion at St. Bridget Church. The medical examiner would later note that her fingers had been deliberately positioned around the religious symbol after death. The Chicago Tribune ran the story on the front page, sending shockwaves through both the Gold Coast and Bridgeport neighborhoods. For weeks, young women traveled in groups, looking over their shoulders. Parents enforced strict curfews. The police interviewed dozens of people, including coworkers, neighbors, and even Robert McNeil, though a clerical error would later obscure this crucial detail. As summer's heat gave way to autumn's chill, the investigation gradually lost momentum. Detectives were reassigned. Witnesses' memories faded, and the Sullivan family's pleas for justice became increasingly desperate. Margaret's parents attended daily mass at St. Bridget, praying for answers that wouldn't come in their lifetime. The case went cold as the leaves fell from Lincoln Park's trees, covering the ground where Margaret had lain. The city moved on, but for the Sullivan family, time stopped on that humid August evening when Margaret walked alone into the darkness. Detective Sarah Chen stood alone in the musty evidence room of the Chicago Police Department, her fingers tracing the edge of a cardboard box labeled Sullivan M. 1963. The smell of mold and old paper hung in the air, triggering memories she had tried to bury for years. Sarah pulled out a manila folder and carefully opened it, revealing black and white photographs of a crime scene from another era. As she spread the contents across the metal table, Sarah felt the familiar ache in her chest. 23 years ago, her mother, a dedicated nurse at Northwestern Memorial, had disappeared without a trace after a late shift. The parallels to Margaret Sullivan's case were impossible to ignore. Both women had vanished while walking alone. Both had been dedicated to helping others. Both cases had gone cold. "Finding anything useful?" Marcus Bell asked, appearing in the doorway with 2 coffee cups. Sarah accepted the drink with a grateful nod. "Maybe." The original detectives interviewed a Robert McNeil who lived near Lincoln Park, but the follow-up seems incomplete. Her partner leaned against the table, studying her face. "This one's getting to you, isn't it?" "I'm fine," she replied automatically, though they both knew it wasn't true. The Sullivan case was becoming more than work. It was a mirror reflecting her own unresolved grief. Later that evening, Sarah spread the case files across her kitchen table. Photos of Margaret Sullivan stared back at her, a young woman with dreams cut short, a family left with questions instead of answers. She pulled out her smartphone and scrolled through the few photographs she had of her mother. The same gentle eyes, the same unfinished story. The detective opened her laptop and began typing notes, connecting threads between witness statements and evidence logs. The similarities to her mother's disappearance fueled her determination. Where others saw a hopeless cold case, Sarah saw possibility, a chance to bring closure to the Sullivan family that she herself had never received. She called Dr. Ellen Grace, the genetic genealogist who had helped with several cold cases. "Ellen, it's Sarah Chen. I need your expertise on something from the 60s. "A bit before my time," Ellen replied with a chuckle. "But DNA doesn't expire if it's properly preserved." "That's what I'm counting on," Sarah said, her eyes fixed on Margaret's case file. As midnight approached, Sarah finally closed the folders. She knew her supervisor would warn her about getting too personally involved, about letting her own trauma drive the investigation. But Sarah understood something her colleagues couldn't. Some ghosts refuse to rest until the truth is found. And sometimes, the only way to silence your own ghosts was to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. In April of 2017, Detective Sarah Chen stood in the basement of the Chicago Police Department, her flashlight beam cutting through decades of dust. The evidence storage room smelled of mildew and forgotten promises. After weeks of searching through mislabeled boxes and outdated filing systems, her persistence paid off when she discovered a small freezer tucked behind metal shelving units. "This has to be it," she whispered to herself, pulling on latex gloves before carefully opening the lid. Inside, preserved in the cold for over 50 years, were the original evidence samples from Margaret Sullivan's case. Clothing fibers, hair strands, and biological material that had been collected but never fully analyzed with modern technology. Sarah immediately contacted Dr. Ellen Grace at Parabon Nanolabs, a specialist in genetic genealogy whose work had revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. The scientist's reputation for meticulous analysis made her the perfect partner for this delicate work. "The preservation is remarkable," Dr. Grace noted during their first video call, her analytical eyes scanning the preliminary reports Sarah had sent. "Low temperatures have kept the DNA relatively intact. We can definitely work with this." Within days, the samples were carefully packaged and shipped to Parabon's facility. Ellen personally oversaw the extraction process, treating each fragment as the precious link to justice it represented. The lab hummed with activity as technicians processed the genetic material through equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to the original investigators in 1963. "We're building family trees based on genetic markers," Ellen explained to Sarah and her partner Marcus Bell during a conference call in late April. "The DNA doesn't just tell us who, it can tell us about family connections, ethnic background, even physical traits the perpetrator might have had. The team began mapping complex genetic relationships, searching for matches in genealogical databases. Each connection formed another branch, another possibility. Marcus remained skeptical, concerned about raising false hopes for the Sullivan family, but Sarah saw the potential breakthrough for what it was. "Margaret has been waiting for 54 years, she told him as they reviewed the preliminary findings in their office. "Science is finally catching up to give her a voice." By early May, the first significant patterns emerged. The perpetrator's DNA suggested connections to several families with deep roots in Chicago's northern neighborhoods. Ellen's team narrowed the search parameters, focusing on male relatives who would have been between 20 and 40 years old in 1963. For Sarah, each new data point felt like Margaret herself was guiding them through time, using strands of genetic code to point toward a truth that had remained hidden for over half a century. By June, the genetic matches from Dr. Ellen Grake's lab had narrowed the search to several prominent Gold Coast families. Detective Sarah Chen sat in her cramped office, surrounded by family trees and genetic profiles, when a name caught her attention: Robert James Mitchell. The connection wasn't just genetic, it was geographical and temporal. He had lived mere blocks from where Margaret Ann Sullivan's body was found in 1963. "I need everything we have on Mitchell," Sarah told Marcus Bell, sliding a notepad across her desk. Her partner nodded, understanding the gravity in her voice. Robert James Mitchell wasn't just anyone in Chicago. Owner of Mitchell & Sons Hardware, his name adorned park benches, scholarship funds, and hospital wings throughout the city. The businessman had built his reputation over decades, attending weekly mass at St. Bridget, funding community programs, and maintaining close ties with city officials. Sarah pulled up newspaper archives on her device. Photos showed Mitchell at charity galas, ribbon cuttings, and community events. His silver hair and practiced smile projected trustworthiness. In one particularly troubling image, he stood beside Patrick Sullivan at a police fundraiser in the 90s. The irony made Sarah's stomach turn. He knew them, she whispered to herself. He knew the Sullivans personally. The detective discovered Mitchell had donated to St. Bridget's Restoration Fund and had even attended memorial services for Margaret over the years. The thought of him standing among mourners, offering condolences for a life he had taken, sent chills down her spine. When Marcus returned with Mitchell's file, another piece fell into place. Born Robert McNeil, he had changed his name after college. Not unusual, but the timing aligned suspiciously close to Margaret's murder. "We need to be careful," Marcus warned. "This man has friends in every corner of this city." Sarah nodded, but her determination only grew. She pinned Mitchell's photograph to her board, studying the face that had fooled an entire community for over 5 decades. That evening, she drove past Mitchell & Sons Hardware, its windows gleaming in the setting sun. Through the glass, she could see Robert himself, laughing with customers, the picture of small business success and community engagement. He locked up, nodded to neighbors, and climbed into his luxury automobile, the embodiment of the American dream. To everyone in Chicago, Robert James Mitchell was untouchable, a pillar of virtue and civic pride. But to Detective Sarah Chen, he had become something else entirely, a person of interest in a 54-year-old murder case, and she was determined to uncover what lay beneath his carefully constructed facade. The evening of August 17th descended on Chicago with a somber weight. 54 years to the day since Margaret Ann Sullivan had vanished, St. Bridget Church glowed with the light of 200 flickering candles. Colleen Sullivan Riley stood at the church steps, greeting mourners with quiet dignity, her hands trembling slightly as she distributed small prayer cards bearing her aunt's photograph. "Thank you for coming," she whispered to each arrival, her voice steady, despite the emotion threatening to break through. Patrick Sullivan stood beside his niece, his weathered face a map of grief that had never fully healed. The retired police officer's eyes constantly scanned the growing crowd, a habit from decades on the force that he couldn't shake. Detective Sarah Chen positioned herself near the back of the gathering, observing. She hadn't come in an official capacity tonight, but the investigation never truly left her thoughts. The detective watched as familiar faces from both Bridgeport and the Gold Coast neighborhoods mingled in shared remembrance. Some who had known Margaret personally, and others who only knew the story that had become part of Chicago's dark folklore. The church bells began to toll at 8:15, the estimated time of Margaret's death. The sound rolled across the neighborhood, causing conversations to fall silent. Father Donovan led the assembly in prayer, his voice carrying through the summer night as he spoke of justice, peace, and the enduring power of memory. It was during the final hymn that Robert James Mitchell arrived. The hardware store owner moved through the crowd with practiced grace, nodding respectfully to those who acknowledged him. His expensive suit seemed out of place among the more modest attire of most attendees, yet his presence was accepted without question, a testament to his standing in the community. "Colleen, my dear," he said, approaching the Sullivan family. "Another year without answers. I'm so sorry." He embraced her, and Sarah noticed how Colleen stiffened slightly before returning the gesture. Mitchell's voice carried just the right amount of emotion, sympathetic but not overwrought. He clasped Patrick's hand firmly, exchanging a few quiet words that made the older man nod appreciatively. Sarah edged closer, studying Mitchell's every movement. There was something too polished about his condolences, too rehearsed in his expressions of sorrow. When he spoke of Margaret, he maintained perfect eye contact, never glancing away as most people did when discussing painful topics. As the vigil concluded and people began to disperse, Sarah watched Mitchell place his candle carefully among the others at the memorial. His fingers lingered on the flame a moment too long, almost caressing it. When he turned away, his face had shifted, the mask of empathy momentarily slipping to reveal something cold underneath before quickly recovering. The detective made a mental note. In that brief, unguarded moment, she had glimpsed something that 54 years of investigation had missed. The crisp October wind whipped through the streets of Chicago as Detective Sarah Chen and her partner, Detective Marcus Bell, sat in their unmarked vehicle. They had been tailing Robert James Mitchell for 3 days, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Today might be it. "There he goes," Marcus whispered, nodding toward the businessman entering a downtown coffee shop. "Same routine as yesterday." Sarah checked her watch. 11:15, right on schedule. They watched through the large windows as Mitchell ordered his usual, chatting amicably with the barista. The hardware store owner carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never been caught. His gray suit impeccably tailored, his smile practiced and warm. "Hard to believe this is the same guy from our case files," Marcus muttered, adjusting his position to keep Mitchell in view. Sarah's eyes narrowed. That's how they survive so long. They blend in. When Mitchell finally exited the establishment, he paused to check his smartphone before continuing down Michigan Avenue. The detectives waited until he was half a block away before Sarah slipped into the coffee shop, her heart pounding despite her calm exterior. "Excuse me," she approached the counter casually. "That gentleman who just left, did he throw away his cup?" The barista pointed to a nearby trash bin. "Just now. Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," Sarah assured her with a practiced smile. She spotted the discarded cup and, using a napkin to avoid contamination, carefully retrieved it and placed it in an evidence bag. Back at the precinct, Dr. Ellen Grace processed the sample with meticulous care. The genetic genealogist had been working with them for months, building family trees and analyzing DNA markers from the original crime scene. "I'll expedite this," Ellen promised, her eyes reflecting the gravity of what they were attempting. 3 days later, Sarah's phone rang at 5 in the morning. She answered before the second ring. "We have a match." Ellen's voice was steady but charged with significance. 99.8% certainty. The DNA on the cup matches the profile from the 1963 evidence. Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of 54 years of injustice pressing down on her shoulders. "You're absolutely certain?" "I ran it twice," the scientist confirmed. "It's him, Sarah." That afternoon, Sarah stood before the caseboard in the precinct, staring at Mitchell's photograph. The respected businessman, the generous donor, the friendly neighbor, now irrefutably linked to Margaret Ann Sullivan's murder. Marcus joined her, coffee in hand. "You okay?" "I'm thinking about the Sullivans," she replied. "About Colleen and Patrick. How do you tell someone that the monster they've been looking for has been sitting at their church pew all these years?" The truth was both vindicating and devastating. Their pillar of the community was about to fall, and the aftershocks would change Chicago forever. Detectives Sarah Chen and Marcus Bell spent long nights at the Chicago Police Department, surrounded by yellowing file boxes and the musty scent of forgotten evidence. They were peeling back decades of history, layer by layer, uncovering the truth about Robert James Mitchell's past. "Look at this," Sarah said, holding up a brittle interview transcript. Mitchell was questioned back in '63, but under a different name, Robert McNeil. Marcus leaned over, squinting at the faded typewritten page. "How did we miss this connection for 54 years? The answer came in the form of a simple clerical error. Someone had misfiled the interview, categorizing McNeil as a witness rather than a person of interest. When Robert changed his surname to Mitchell after inheriting his uncle's hardware business, the connection vanished completely. A paper trail disrupted by the analog record-keeping of the pre-digital era. "He reinvented himself," Sarah whispered, tracing the signature on the document. "Became a pillar of the community while hiding in plain sight." The detective team methodically reconstructed Mitchell's movements on that August night in 1963. A dry cleaning receipt found near Margaret Sullivan's body had initially been dismissed as unrelated evidence. Now, they discovered it belonged to Mitchell's former roommate, placing him in proximity to the crime scene. Ellen Grace joined them the following morning, bringing enhanced photographs of footprints from the original crime scene. "The impression shows someone with a slight limp," she explained, pointing to the uneven depth pattern. Sarah's pulse quickened. "Mitchell has that old injury from college football." They pulled medical records, confirming that Robert had suffered a knee injury playing for Loyola in 1961. The limp would have been noticeable in '63, though it had improved over time. "He was hiding in plain sight all these years," Marcus said, shaking his head. "Attending the same church as the Sullivans, donating to community causes. Building a fortress of respectability," Sarah finished. "No one would suspect the generous hardware store owner who sponsored Little League teams." The team created a timeline on the department's whiteboard, connecting evidence points with red marker. Mitchell's transformation from Robert McNeil to respected businessman wasn't just a name change. It was a calculated rebirth designed to bury his past. As they worked, Sarah couldn't help thinking about Colleen Sullivan Riley and Patrick Sullivan. How would they process this betrayal? The man who had offered condolences at family vigils was the very monster who had taken Margaret from them. The past was unraveling at last, threads of deception coming loose after decades of careful maintenance. For Sarah, each revelation felt like both victory and heartbreak, the truth emerging from shadows where it had been deliberately hidden for far too long. The November chill settled over Chicago as Detective Sarah Chen and her partner Marcus Bell approached Robert James Mitchell's stately Gold Coast home. Armed with a search warrant, they were met with a businessman's practiced smile, the same one that had charmed the community for decades. "This is unnecessary," Mitchell insisted, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "I've cooperated fully." The search team methodically combed through the elegant residence, focusing on Mitchell's private workshop in the basement. Sarah noticed how meticulously organized the space was, tools hanging in perfect alignment, surfaces spotless. The detective's instincts sharpened when she spotted a workbench that seemed oddly out of place among the precision. "Check underneath," she instructed, pointing to a barely visible seam along the bottom edge. The technician discovered a concealed button that, when pressed, revealed a hidden compartment. Inside lay a handbag, worn brown leather, its surface dulled by years of darkness. Sarah immediately recognized it from the case files. Margaret Ann Sullivan's missing purse, untouched since 1963. "Evidence team," she called, her voice barely masking her emotion. "We need documentation, now." Mitchell's composure finally cracked. The businessman slumped against the wall, the facade of respectability crumbling as officers photographed the discovery. This wasn't just evidence. It was a trophy he had kept mere feet below where he ate dinner with his family for over 5 decades. The handbag was carefully transported to the forensics lab. Under the bright lights, technicians gently opened it, revealing a time capsule of a young woman's life cut short. Inside, they found Margaret's lipstick, still capped, the color a muted coral, alongside a rosary with wooden beads worn smooth from prayer. Most heartbreaking was a faded note, the handwriting delicate and hopeful, from her best friend congratulating her on her nursing school acceptance. When Sarah called Colleen Sullivan Riley with the news, the line went silent for several long moments. "He kept it all this time?" Colleen finally whispered. "While attending our family funerals? While donating to St. Bridget's?" The discovery became the emotional center of the case. For the Sullivan family, the handbag represented both profound violation and long-delayed confirmation. For the prosecution, it was irrefutable evidence of Mitchell's guilt, not just of murder, but of decades of calculated deception. The community that had once revered the hardware store owner now recoiled in horror. The handbag, displayed in court photographs, became a symbol of innocence destroyed and justice delayed. Any lingering doubts about Mitchell's culpability vanished like morning fog over Lake Michigan, leaving only the harsh clarity of truth in their wake. Patrick Sullivan sat in the Chicago Police Department interrogation room, not as the respected retired officer he was, but as a witness whose world was crumbling. His weathered hands trembled as Detective Sarah Chen placed the faded police report in front of him. The date, October 12, 1988, was written in his own handwriting. "You took this report from Robert Mitchell about a break-in at his hardware store," Sarah explained gently. "He was using his business to establish an alibi for another incident that night." Patrick stared at his signature, the blue ink now faded to gray. "I remember him," he whispered. "Polite, concerned about his store. I had no idea." His voice cracked. "This man killed my sister, and I helped him cover up another crime." The irony crushed him. For decades, Patrick had dedicated his life to justice, carrying his badge with pride while carrying Margaret's memory in his heart. Now he discovered he'd unwittingly aided her killer, exchanging pleasantries with the monster who had taken everything from his family. "It's not your fault," Sarah assured him, her empathy stemming from her own unresolved loss. Mitchell manipulated everyone around him. Across town, Colleen Sullivan Riley sat alone in her Gold Coast apartment, surrounded by family photographs. She remembered how Mitchell had attended Margaret's memorial services over the years, how he donated to the scholarship fund in her aunt's name. The businessman had even consoled her, his hand on her shoulder, telling her to stay strong. "He touched me," she told Marcus Bell when the detective visited. "He stood in our church, prayed with our family, all while knowing." Colleen couldn't finish the sentence. The betrayal was too profound, too intimate. The revelation fractured the Sullivan family in unexpected ways. Cousins who hadn't spoken in years called each other, sharing disbelief. Uncles who had done business with Mitchell & Sons Hardware questioned every interaction. Aunts who had accepted his condolences felt violated by his false sympathy. Patrick drove to St. Bridget that evening, seeking solace in the familiar pews. Instead, he found Colleen already there, kneeling in prayer. "I accepted his donations," she said without looking up. I thanked him for his generosity. Patrick sat beside his niece, and I shook his hand every year at the vigil. Their shared guilt hung between them, not just for their unwitting interactions with Mitchell, but for the decades they'd spent looking elsewhere for answers, while the killer lived comfortably among them. "We couldn't have known," Patrick finally said, though the words felt hollow. Colleen nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the altar. The truth had arrived too late to save Margaret, but perhaps not too late for justice. News of Robert James Mitchell's arrest spread through Chicago like wildfire, leaving both the Gold Coast and Bridgeport neighborhoods reeling. The morning papers displayed his face prominently. The same face that had smiled from charity gala photos and business award ceremonies for decades. Overnight, a pillar of the community had become its greatest disgrace. "It's simply not possible," insisted Eleanor Winters, who had lived across from Mitchell for 15 years. Bob donated to every fundraiser, remembered everyone's birthdays. "This is clearly a mistake." She wasn't alone. A small group of supporters gathered outside the businessman's now empty home, holding signs proclaiming his innocence. In stark contrast, whispers circulated among other neighbors, who claimed they'd always sensed something unsettling about him. "There was always something in his eyes," confided Thomas Riley, who had worked briefly at Mitchell & Sons Hardware. "Too perfect, you know, like he was playing a role." At St. Bridget Church, where both the Sullivan family and Mitchell had attended Mass for years, Father Michael Donovan struggled to address the congregation. The parish hall, normally reserved for bake sales and community meetings, became an impromptu gathering place for parishioners processing their shock. "He funded our new roof," whispered one elderly woman, clutching her rosary. "How do we reconcile that with what we're saying he did?" The church leaders faced an impossible dilemma. Mitchell's name adorned the plaque of major donors in the vestibule. His contributions had funded scholarships for local children. Yet now, those same gifts felt tainted, stained by the blood of Margaret Sullivan. In Bridgeport, where the Sullivan family had deep roots, the reaction was more uniform. Anger simmered just below the surface as residents recalled how Mitchell had attended memorial services for Margaret, had comforted Patrick, and even presented Colleen with a St. Bridget medal on her confirmation day. "The audacity," spat Maria Connolly, who had known the Sullivans since childhood. "To stand there with us, year after year, knowing what he did." Local businesses removed photos featuring Mitchell from their walls. The hardware store, now managed by his son who claimed no knowledge of his father's crime, saw its customers dwindle to a trickle. The community found itself divided, not just between belief and disbelief, but between those who could acknowledge the complexity of evil and those who couldn't fathom that someone they trusted could harbor such darkness. Parents struggled to explain to their children how someone everyone respected could have committed such a terrible act. By nightfall, candles appeared on porches throughout both neighborhoods, silent tributes to Margaret, whose memory had never truly faded from Chicago's consciousness, even after 54 years. The February chill settled over the Cook County Courthouse as the trial of Robert James Mitchell finally began. National news vans lined the streets, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metal flowers seeking light in the Chicago winter. Outside the imposing granite building, two distinct crowds had formed, one demanding justice for Margaret Ann Sullivan, the other steadfastly proclaiming Mitchell's innocence despite the mounting evidence. "He donated to my son's baseball team for 20 years, a woman told a reporter, clutching a handmade sign reading, "Wrong Man." 10 feet away, separated by barricades and police officers, another group chanted, "Justice for Margaret," in rhythmic unison. Inside courtroom 3, Assistant State's Attorney Melissa Donovan approached the jury box with measured steps. "For 54 years," she began, her voice filling the hushed room, Robert Mitchell has lived a lie. He has accepted handshakes at church, donations at charity events, and even embraced the very family he devastated. Mitchell sat at the defense table in an expensive charcoal suit, his posture rigid, eyes forward. The respected business owner's carefully constructed facade had begun to crack under the weight of scientific evidence. His attorney, a former prosecutor himself, scribbled notes furiously. The prosecution methodically laid out their case: the DNA match from the coffee cup to crime scene evidence, the testimony from Dr. Ellen Grace about genetic markers, and the devastating discovery of Margaret's handbag in Mitchell's home. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer blow in the silent courtroom. Patrick Sullivan sat in the front row, his weathered hands trembling as photographs of his sister's belongings were displayed on a large screen. The retired police officer who had unknowingly taken Mitchell's report decades earlier now watched justice unfold, with tears tracking silently down his lined face. Beside him, Colleen Sullivan Riley maintained a steely gaze, her eyes never leaving Mitchell's back. When the prosecutor asked her to identify her aunt's possessions, she spoke clearly, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to break through. Detective Sarah Chen testified about finding the evidence, her professional demeanor briefly faltering, only when describing the moment they discovered the handbag in Mitchell's workbench. Her partner, Marcus Bell, confirmed each detail with precise, unembellished testimony. The defendant believed time was his ally. Donovan told the jury he believed that memories fade, that evidence deteriorates, that witnesses die. But what he didn't count on was that truth leaves traces that can never truly disappear. As court adjourned for the day, reporters rushed to file their stories. The headline would read across America the next morning: "Pillar of Community or Calculating Killer? Jury to decide in decades-old murder." The courtroom fell into absolute silence as District Attorney Marissa Winters carefully placed the evidence bag on the table. She slipped on latex gloves with practiced precision, her movements deliberate as all eyes tracked her hands. The handbag, Margaret Ann Sullivan's handbag, had been preserved in an evidence locker for over 5 decades before being discovered in Robert James Mitchell's home. "The people present Exhibit 42, Winters announced, her voice echoing through the hushed chamber. As the prosecutor unzipped the weathered purse, Colleen Sullivan Riley gripped the edge of her seat. The leather creaked open, revealing contents untouched since 1963. A tube of Revlon lipstick in Cherries in the Snow, its metal case tarnished but still intact. A small leather wallet containing $2.35, a handwritten grocery list. And there, nestled against the lining, a prayer card from St. Bridget's Church with the image of St. Therese, the Little Flower. Patrick Sullivan's weathered face crumpled. The retired police officer who had dedicated his life to protecting others couldn't protect his own sister. He reached for Colleen's hand, their fingers intertwining in shared grief. The defendant kept these items, Winters continued, not as mementos of guilt, but as trophies of power. From the witness stand, Detective Sarah Chen watched the Sullivan family. She recognized their expressions, the same haunted look she saw in her own mirror when thinking about her mother. The genetic genealogist, Dr. Ellen Grace, sat in the gallery, her scientific detachment momentarily broken by the humanity of the moment. Mitchell stared straight ahead, his once commanding presence diminished in his county-issued jumpsuit. The hardware store owner, who had built an empire of respect in Chicago, now couldn't meet the eyes of anyone in the room. When the prayer card was projected onto the courtroom screen, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Written in Margaret's neat penmanship was a simple note: "Lord, guide me to serve others with compassion." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The young woman who dreamed of becoming a nurse had been murdered by a man who later portrayed himself as a community servant. For Colleen, seeing her aunt's handwriting was like hearing her voice across time. These weren't just items. They were pieces of Margaret's soul, preserved in a twisted shrine by her killer. The weight of 56 years pressed down on every heart in the room. Detective Marcus Bell, seated behind the prosecution table, passed a tissue box to the Sullivan family. In that moment, as the handbag's contents were cataloged for the record, justice wasn't an abstract concept, but a tangible presence, as real as the lipstick that would never again touch Margaret Ann Sullivan's lips. The courtroom fell silent as Eleanor Mitchell took the stand. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her designer skirt, the weight of 5 decades pressing down on her shoulders. Under oath, she finally admitted what she had kept hidden for years. She had discovered a bundle of letters from 1963 tucked away in her husband's mahogany desk drawer nearly 15 years ago. "I found them while looking for our tax documents," Eleanor explained, her voice barely audible. "They were tied with twine and hidden beneath a false bottom." Assistant District Attorney Melissa Donovan approached with measured steps. "And what did these letters contain, Mrs. Mitchell?" Eleanor's composure cracked. Correspondence between Robert and someone named M. Details about meetings in Lincoln Park. Things I wouldn't believe my husband capable of. The letters, Eleanor confessed, had contained disturbing references to Margaret Sullivan, including descriptions of her daily routines at Illinois Bell and mentions of a handbag. Most damning was a draft of what appeared to be a confession never sent. "So you destroyed evidence in a murder investigation?" Donovan stated flatly. "I burned them in our fireplace," Eleanor whispered. "I told myself they were fiction, perhaps for a novel he wanted to write." From her seat beside Patrick Sullivan, Colleen watched with a mixture of rage and pity. The woman had chosen willful blindness over truth, her loyalty to Robert James Mitchell outweighing justice for Margaret. Detective Sarah Chen sat rigid in the gallery, her notebook open but untouched. She recognized the pattern all too well, the protective silence of those closest to predators. It reminded her of her mother's case, where neighbors had heard nothing. Despite obvious signs of struggle, Dr. Ellen Grace, testifying as an expert witness, later explained how the destroyed letters might have provided additional DNA evidence or timeline confirmation that could have solved the case years earlier. The destruction of these documents, Donovan argued in her closing statement, represents more than one woman protecting her husband. It symbolizes how this entire community shielded a monster because acknowledging his existence was too uncomfortable. The prosecution displayed photographs of Mitchell at charity galas, church functions, and community awards ceremonies, all attended after Eleanor discovered the letters. Each image hammered home the same point. Silence had allowed him to maintain his facade of respectability. In the courthouse hallway during recess, Marcus Bell placed a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder. "This case isn't just about Mitchell anymore," he observed quietly. "It's about all the people who looked away." Sarah nodded, watching Colleen and Patrick huddled together near the water fountain. "Sometimes," she replied, "the most dangerous accomplice is denial." The call came on a rainy Tuesday. Sarah Chen was reviewing evidence photos when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end belonged to Walter Kinsella, a retired Chicago Tribune reporter who had covered crime in the 60s. "I need to tell you something about the Sullivan case," he said, his voice wavering with age and what Sarah recognized as long-carried guilt, something I should have said decades ago. They met at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the Tribune's offices. Walter Kinsella was in his 80s now, thin and stooped, but his eyes remained sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He placed a worn leather portfolio on the table between them. "I wrote 6 articles about Margaret's murder," he explained, sliding yellow drafts across the table. "Only 2 ever made it to print, and those were gutted." Sarah examined the pages, noting detailed interviews with witnesses her team had never known existed. Walter had traced Margaret's final hours with precision that would have aided the original investigation immensely. "My editor killed the stories," Walter continued, stirring his coffee absently. said it wasn't newsworthy enough, but that wasn't the truth. The journalist described how Robert Mitchell had approached him at a charity function at St. Bridget's, just days after Margaret's body was found. Mitchell had placed a friendly hand on his shoulder, mentioned Walter's young children by name, and suggested that sensationalizing the tragedy would only hurt the community. "He never threatened me outright," Walter said. "He didn't have to. Everyone knew his connections. The publisher played golf with him weekly. The mayor attended his Christmas parties." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. Why come forward now? Walter's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his cup. "I saw Colleen on television after the arrest. The look in her eyes, it's the same look I see in the mirror every morning." He explained how he'd kept his drafts all these years, a private penance for his silence. When Mitchell was arrested, the guilt had become unbearable. "Power doesn't just silence victims," Walter said. "It silences truth-tellers too. I failed that girl. I failed her family." Sarah carefully placed the articles in an evidence bag. These wouldn't change the DNA evidence against Mitchell, but they painted a damning picture of how deliberately he had controlled the narrative around Margaret's death. "You're helping her now," Sarah said quietly. As they parted, Walter handed her one more item, a small notebook with observations he'd made about Mitchell's demeanor at Margaret's funeral. "Some truths," he said, "take a lifetime to tell." Detective Sarah Chen sat on a wooden bench by North Pond, watching the early spring light dance across the water. The Mitchell case files lay closed beside her, but the weight of their contents pressed against her thoughts. This place, so peaceful now, had once cradled Margaret Ann Sullivan's broken body, hidden beneath evergreen branches on that August night in 1963. Sarah pulled her jacket tighter against the chill. As the trial's conclusion approached, she found herself drawn to this spot, seeking something she couldn't quite name. The rippling water mirrored her own turbulent emotions, stirring memories she'd kept carefully compartmentalized for years. "Mom would have been 59 this year," she whispered to no one. 27 years had passed since her mother, a night shift nurse, had disappeared walking home from Chicago Memorial. The case remained unsolved, one of many that haunted the department's archives. She traced the grain of the bench with her fingertip, remembering how Marcus had found her here yesterday, concern etched on his face. "You're not just working this case anymore, are you?" her partner had asked, settling beside her with 2 coffee cups. His perception had always been unnervingly accurate. "I keep seeing my mother in Margaret's story," Sarah had admitted, accepting the warm beverage. Different decades, different circumstances, but the same silence afterward. Now alone, Sarah watched a family walking along the path, a father lifting his daughter onto his shoulders while her mother laughed. The simple joy of their togetherness made Sarah's chest ache. How many moments like these had the Sullivans lost? How many had her own father missed after her mother vanished? She opened her smartphone, scrolling to the photo of Colleen and Patrick Sullivan at yesterday's pre-trial meeting. Their faces showed the strain of decades waiting for answers. Yet there was something else there too, a resilience that Sarah recognized and admired. For the first time since becoming a detective, Sarah allowed her professional distance to dissolve completely. Tears came silently at first, then in shuddering waves that bent her forward on the bench. She cried for Margaret, for her mother, for Patrick's lost sister, and Colleen's lost aunt. She cried for every family caught in the purgatory of not knowing. When the tears finally subsided, Sarah felt a strange lightening, as if something calcified within her had finally broken free. The empathy she'd always kept carefully measured, a tool for investigation rather than a personal indulgence, now flowed without restraint. Standing, she gathered the case files and took one last look at North Pond. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, but today had brought something equally important: the understanding that her connection to this case wasn't a weakness, but her greatest strength. The courtroom fell silent as the jury foreman rose to deliver the verdict. It was March 15th, 2018. A date that would forever mark the end of a 55-year journey for the Sullivan family. Outside the Cook County Courthouse, reporters huddled against the late winter chill, while inside, Colleen Sullivan Riley gripped her uncle's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. On the count of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Robert James Mitchell, guilty. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Patrick Sullivan, his weathered face etched with decades of grief, closed his eyes as tears streamed down his cheeks. The retired officer, who had unknowingly taken Mitchell's report years ago, now witnessed justice finally arriving for his sister. Robert Mitchell stood motionless, his expensive suit suddenly looking too large for his diminished frame. The businessman who had walked Chicago's Gold Coast with impunity for over 5 decades now faced the reality of spending his remaining years behind bars. As court officers approached, the mask of respectability he had worn for a lifetime crumbled visibly. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, the public saw not the generous hardware store owner, but the predator who had hidden among them. Detective Sarah Chen watched from her seat beside Marcus Bell, her partner throughout the investigation. She remained stoic, though her eyes betrayed a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and personal catharsis. The case that had become intertwined with her own loss had reached its conclusion. "All rise," called the bailiff as the judge prepared to address the court. The sentencing would come later, but everyone knew Mitchell would never again walk free. As he was led away in handcuffs, several of his former friends and neighbors turned their backs, a silent repudiation of the man they thought they knew. Outside on the courthouse steps, Colleen faced a wall of microphones. "Isn't about celebration," she said, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "It's about acknowledgement of Margaret's life, of the truth we deserved to know decades ago." For the Sullivan family, the verdict brought not triumph, but release, a weight lifted after generations of carrying it. Patrick stood beside his niece, his police training evident in his composure, though his reddened eyes revealed the emotional toll. That evening, Chicago mourned what was lost, not just Margaret Ann Sullivan's promising future, but the collective innocence of a community that had willfully ignored warning signs for so long. At St. Bridget Church in Bridgeport, candles flickered as parishioners gathered in quiet reflection, contemplating how evil had lived so comfortably among them, hidden behind charitable donations and Sunday smiles. Justice had arrived, delayed but not denied, leaving an indelible mark on everyone it touched. The shockwaves of Robert James Mitchell's conviction rippled through Chicago like the winter winds off Lake Michigan. In both the affluent Gold Coast and working-class Bridgeport neighborhoods, residents struggled to reconcile their memories of the respected hardware store owner with the monster who had hidden among them for over 5 decades. On a crisp April morning, more than 100 people gathered near North Pond in Lincoln Park for the dedication of a memorial bench. The simple wooden seat faced the water, inscribed with Margaret Ann Sullivan's name and words from Psalm 23. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Colleen Sullivan Riley stood beside her uncle, both of them weathered by grief, yet somehow lighter now that justice had been served. "My aunt never got to become a nurse or raise a family," Colleen told the assembled crowd, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "But her legacy will protect others." In the months following the trial, she had channeled her pain into purpose, founding a support network for families of cold case victims. The organization helped navigate the emotional terrain of reopened wounds and delayed justice. Patrick Sullivan, his police badge now replaced with a simple lapel pin bearing his sister's initials, became a regular speaker at law enforcement conferences across the Midwest. The retired cop shared his unique perspective as both an officer and a victim's family member, emphasizing the importance of preserving evidence, regardless of how hopeless a case might seem. Perhaps the most tangible impact came when the Chicago City Council unanimously passed what became known as Margaret's Law. The legislation required the police department to review unsolved homicides every 5 years, utilizing the latest genetic genealogy techniques. Detective Sarah Chen stood in the back of the chamber during the vote, thinking of her own mother and all the other families still waiting for answers. The community's healing was neither quick nor complete. St. Bridget Church held monthly remembrance services, not just for Margaret, but for all victims of violence. The Mitchell & Sons hardware store was sold, renamed, and renovated, as if the city itself was trying to wash away the stain of what had happened. In Bridgeport, Sunday dinners continued as they had for generations. But now, Margaret's story was told openly, no longer a whispered tragedy, but a testament to persistence and truth. The neighborhood that had shaped her short life now honored her memory by refusing to look away from difficult realities. As spring turned to summer, yellow roses, Margaret's favorite, bloomed around her memorial bench, planted by people she had never met but who carried her story in their hearts. Sarah Chen stood at the edge of North Pond, watching the morning light dance across the water. 1 year had passed since Robert James Mitchell's conviction, and the ripples of the case continued to spread throughout Chicago. Her investigation had become a blueprint at the department, with 3 cold cases already solved using similar genetic genealogy techniques. "You changed everything," said Marcus Bell, approaching with 2 coffee cups. Her partner handed her one, steam rising between them in the cool spring air. "The Sullivan case is now required reading at the academy." Sarah nodded, thinking of the young detectives who now approached her with questions and admiration. Some had family members who'd never received closure. Others simply believed in the work. All of them understood what the Sullivan case had taught them, that time could obscure truth, but never erase it completely. At St. Bridget Church, Colleen Sullivan Riley had established the Margaret Ann Sullivan Nursing Scholarship, fulfilling her aunt's interrupted dream. Each year, a promising student from Bridgeport would receive funding for Loyola's nursing program, carrying Margaret's legacy forward. The first recipient had just completed her first semester with honors. Patrick Sullivan, once burdened by guilt, now spoke regularly at police conferences about the importance of revisiting cold cases. His weathered face would soften when describing his sister, not as a victim, but as the bright young woman who once filled their family kitchen with laughter. "The hardest part," he often said, "isn't losing someone, it's losing the truth about them." The memorial bench near where Margaret's body had been found became a quiet place of reflection. Its simple inscription, "Margaret Ann Sullivan, Truth Finds Light," alongside her favorite psalm, drew visitors who left flowers and handwritten notes. Some were from people who remembered her, others from those who simply understood loss. The neighborhoods of Chicago had changed too. In Gold Coast, the Mitchell & Sons hardware store had been sold, the proceeds directed to victims' advocacy groups at the family's insistence. In Bridgeport, Sunday dinners still featured roast beef and potatoes, but now often included stories about Margaret, not how she died, but how she lived. Dr. Ellen Grace had published a paper on the case, establishing protocols for genetic genealogy in decades-old crimes. Her work ensured that other families might find the answers that had eluded the Sullivans for 54 years. As Sarah walked away from the pond, she thought about what Margaret's case had taught them all. That evil could hide behind respectability, that communities could unknowingly harbor darkness, but also that truth, when pursued with persistence and compassion, would eventually find its way into the light. The fog had lifted from Chicago's longest-standing mystery, and in its place stood a legacy of justice that would endure for generations to come.